Good morning, moms of Master Books. Hey, hope you're having a fantastic week. Today, we're talking about teaching tips, and the topic that we're on is developing creativity. And why do I think creativity is so important? Because creative people are the culture changers. They're the game changers. They're the ones who think differently. They present different ideas. They create the narratives that culture embraces. And I think that it's important that for our children as Christian believers, that they're creative, that they think of creative ways to present the gospel, creative ways to reach the lost, creative ways to defend their faith and to change culture. We are spiraling right down a dangerous path as a society, and our kids are the game changers. And I think it's important that we give them every advantage and every tool that we can. Creativity is one of those tools. And I think what happens is we educate the creativity out of our children. So a study, let me read you the study. There was a study done. The name of the book is called Breakpoint and Beyond, Mastering the Future Today. And what it studied was the capacity for creativity. So it wasn't studying necessarily just creativity, but it was the capacity. Like a question might be, how many uses can you describe for a paperclip? Extremely creative people would be asking questions like not just trying to define the paperclip, but then they would also even ask like, well, how does a paperclip have to only be small? Can it be a big paperclip? And so they would ask even bigger questions. So they did this study, and they started with children who were they tested kindergartners, and they wanted to know at what level they were. To have this creative capacity, the concept is called divergent thinking, meaning multiple solutions for one question. But if they ask these people what percentage of them would be geniuses. Now you would expect, right, that if I ask a kindergartner their capacity for creativity and intelligence, all of these things, that they would actually, as we get educated and go through school, that we would increase in our capacity for creativity. This is what the study found. So they followed the creative capacity through childhood. They tested as kindergartners. 98% of the study subjects scored at a genius level in divergent thinking, meaning they had a capacity for creativity. 98% of kindergartners score at a genius level for having a capacity for creativity. When they were 10, 5 years of education, 32% of that group scored that high. 70% almost of them lost that capacity in the 5 years that they were schooled. By the age of 15, only 10% had made the cut. And get this, when 200,000 adults were given the same test, only 2% of them scored at a genius level. Isn't that crazy? To think that as kindergartners, they have this capacity for creativity, the ideas come, and what happens? Why do we lose that? And I think a lot of it is actually the education system. What we do with our students is we want them to look at concrete things, and we teach them, it's 2 + 2 = 4. There's one answer. The consequences of not getting that one answer correct are dire. Right? If you don't answer correctly, you're not moving forward to the next grade. If you don't answer correctly, we're going to shame you. There's different factors that weigh into this. And so the education system focuses very heavily on the who, the what, the where, and the when. These are the details that we focus on. In a lot of textbooks, a lot of the rigorous type programs that we're used to and comfortable with, that's what they focus on. Who, what, where, and when. Those are the types of, when did it happen? Who was doing it? Where did it happen? Those are the safe, concrete type answers. And a lot of the education system was heavily influenced by the industrial age. And how do you make good factory workers? Well, number one, you teach them to do their job. When the bell rings, they go to their station. They work a day, they go in the morning, they come back in the evening. We have a very industrialized education system, and it's very good at what it does. It removes creativity because from an industrialization standpoint, creative thinkers can be problems, right? I mean, I want somebody who sits at the assembly line not to be questioning and trying to come up with new ideas. I want them just to do what they do every day, all day long. And then when the bell rings, they can go home. Okay, so a lot of our academia focuses on who, what, where, when. How can we begin to develop creativity in our students? What can we begin to do, even as adults? Studies have shown that creativity doesn't, even though 10% lost that, the beauty of creativity and having a capacity for creativity is you can develop it. It's almost like a muscle. If you don't use it, it atrophies and you lose the strength. But if you begin working it again, if you continue to exercise that muscle of creativity, you actually can build that capacity back. And so even for us as adults who say, maybe we're not creative, and creativity is more than arts and crafts. It's more than being able to sit down and create a piece of music. Even though that's part of being creative, that's not creativity. Creativity is a capacity to ask bigger questions. It's the capacity to think of different solutions and to have to not be there's one answer and this is the correct answer or else. So even as a mom or dad, you have the ability to start developing creativity in what you do. One of the biggest killers of creativity is fear, right? We fear that if our kids or if we are creative, we're going to make mistakes. And this fear of mistakes, I really think we have to get over this. I have one of my children who's learning a lot in life right now, and it's exciting to see. But there's mistakes being made, and the intensity of not wanting to have made a mistake is causing a lot of anxiety. Who cares if you make some mistakes as long as you're learning? Think again of the child who's learning to walk, and we tumble and we fall and they get back up and they ready themselves and they learn how to get their balance. That's life. That's healthy. This is how we learn, is by making mistakes. And I think we have to get out of the mindset of perfectionism, because perfectionism is just this nasty beast, right? It drives us to be excellent, and excellent is awesome. But when perfectionism becomes a master and it intimidates us through fear that if we don't get it perfect, then we somehow fail, that's like a slavery, a mental slavery. It's unfolding. It's a mental slavery of just its weapon, and it creates this anxiety that we live under and this tension. I think it's okay for us as adults to say, guess what? We're going to be creative. We're even going to be creative in homeschooling, and some of what we do may not work. That's okay. Some of what we discover may actually work better. The paradigms, so many times we try to tweak reality of where we are and make these changes to, things aren't going as smooth as possible in our homes or in our schools. And so we try to make these tweaks, or we'll try harder, or we'll do better, or whatever. And sometimes we have to almost say, okay, throw it all away. If I stepped back to this situation today, how would I deal differently? Like, how would we, if we had money and we had all access to anything, money, time, talent, resources, anything like that. How would we structure our homeschool? And just think of those possibilities, and then look at creating solutions that way. So what are some ways, just some practical tips that you can do to begin fostering creativity? I'll give you a couple of examples. And then, I mean, there are thousands of ways you could take this, but the idea is you want to begin exercises that allow you to start thinking of multiple solutions rather than one solution. So academically, Master Books, one of the things that we love, the Charlotte Mason method gives us a lot of room to ask bigger questions. So rather than just who, what, where, when, we're able to ask the why and maybe the how. One of the strengths, I believe, of Math Lessons for a Living Education is that it actually puts the math in the context of a story and helps create more of a holistic, big brain approach to thinking. Same with language lessons. So when you're learning to write, when a student actually writes a song and is asked, write your own psalm, in that one exercise, so many times you see a student, all of a sudden something happens and they get excited about writing and being creative, because there's a lot of possibility in a song, and the rules, you just don't have as many rules. You have styles and so many different things. And so you allow that creativity. Well, in the academic side, and I think with Master Books, you can explore those things a lot more. And we see this frustration, right? There's this tension when parents come to American history for high school or the world history. They hate sometimes the open-ended questions because they want, what year did Columbus discover America? And they don't want to look at some of these bigger questions that really don't always have good answers. But the ability to actually think about these things is so important. Okay, so I'm going to touch on a controversial issue, and stick with me. But culturally, it's so easy sometimes to be told what we believe, right? We live in a diverse culture. We are to accept everything that comes our way, except evangelical Christianity. We're told how to view certain past events in history. And one of the things I love, this book is America's Story 2. It actually talks about the Native American Indians. So let me tell you a backstory before I read this. Kristen and I pastored in a community that bordered a reservation and we were able to pastor a satellite church on the Seneca Nation Indian Reservation. And through that process, we got to meet a lot of exceptional people. And one day, I was kind of struggling though, because culturally I didn't really fit in to the Native American culture. And one day, a man came up to me. He handed me a CD, and he said, "You really need to listen to this to understand why you're struggling." And so I listened to this cassette, and the first thing it starts out with is a man of Colonel Richard Pratt. And so I share the same last name as this gentleman who gets the credit for the Carlisle Indian School. And it talked about, the Native American schools and what had happened. So in this book, it's talking about the Native Americans, and it says, for some Americans, it was not enough for the Native Americans to be living in restricted areas on reservations. Some well-meaning Christians felt it was their duty to educate and convert Native American children. With federal requirements for their children to be educated, Native American parents had little choice in sending their children away to these schools. Many people supported these efforts did not realize at the time how much damage was being done to children and that their Native American families and to their culture. Established by General Richard Henry Pratt in 1879, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School would sadly become the model for the Native American boarding schools. He made his harmful view on educating Native American children known when he stated, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." So began a systematic stripping away of any and all parts of the Native American culture for these young students, including their traditional clothing, hairstyles, customs, religion, language, and even their names. All of this was so that they would fit in what was perceived as the acceptable cultural habits at the time. Sadly, it would be almost 100 years before Native American tribes could finally control the education of their children, and these boarding schools were closed. Okay, so the Native American schools that were established, you'll often hear about this in history. Well, the question at the bottom of the page says, discuss the trouble with Native Americans. How could this have been handled better? Okay, this is a great place to be creative. There is no answer. There is no easy answer. The answer is it's complicated. At that time, and even pastoring on the reservation, I met people, the school's closed not that long ago. And the community that we pastored in, actually, they integrated the school again. In my lifetime, the school was integrated so that the Native Americans from the Seneca Nation Indian Reservation were going to the school in the community, and all of that had happened. But I got to speak with individuals who went to the Native American schools, and some would tell you it was the best thing that ever happened to them, and others would tell you it was the worst thing that ever happened. And for some, it absolutely destroyed them. For others, it gave them opportunities. And there's no easy answer, because when we look at this, you say, oh my goodness, how could this happen? How could the government come into a place, take these kids, rip them away from their families, send them to a boarding school, and change their names and their identities and their culture? What gives the government the right to do that? That's a tragedy. And okay, so we have that. And at the time, there were some horrific situations happening. Alcoholism was rampant, disease was rampant. There were just a lot of things going on. And some of these people, Colonel Richard Pratt was actually an advocate of the Native Americans, and he was trying to help them the best that he could, and understanding it was different times. And so when I say it's complicated, it really is complicated. There's not an easy answer to this. So it can't be true or false, A, B, or C, or D. It has to be thought about from a much bigger issue. And so someone can say, well, what right did the government have to come into this situation and steal these kids away? And then you can say, okay, but what about today? What if today there's a child who maybe is being neglected because the parent has an addiction, or there's abuse? Would we say it's okay for the government to step in and save that child from that abuse and try to put them in a better environment? We do that today. We have child protective services and foster care that determines what's right and best for the child as a culture and as a society. And so we can point our fingers in the 1800s and say that was terrible, but at the same time, we still do that culturally today. So when I say it's complicated, you get why I'm saying it's complicated, right? But creatively, when we actually start looking at this and then we ask questions, what are some ideas? How could we have done better as a society? How can we learn from the lessons of the past? And this is what happened culturally. How do we learn today when children are in crisis? It's easy to look at something from 100+ years ago and say, shame on them for doing that. But then when we look at today, we're able to, is it any different? And how can we as people perform differently? And just beginning to think about what are the possible answers to this. That question, discuss the trouble with the Native Americans, how could this have been handled better, is a very broad question that opens up a lot of opportunity for creative thinking. And I think something that's important with your students is even to say, there isn't a wrong answer. Okay, now the conclusion that we draw at the end of this isn't wrong. In college, I worked a lot with business. My degree is business marketing, and part of my training was in developing teams. And so teams was a hard concept to get at first, but then I really began to enjoy the concept, because what you would do is we would all sit in a room with a wall, and we'd take sticky notes, right? The kind that have some kind of adhesive, and we would list a problem. And as the problem was out there, people could just throw out ideas. And so you would write solutions to the problems. There was no right or wrong answer. At this point, it was, don't worry about it. Just throw your ideas out there. Let's get them out there. And then you would write, the ideas on the pad, and then they would take it and they would stick it to the wall. And there might be 100 ideas stuck to the wall from the team. Then we would go through and start working to eliminate those ideas to come up with the best options to solve the problem. And so at the initial phase, what you want to do with your student and yourself is say, okay, nothing's off the table. It's safe for right now to brainstorm, to just whatever comes to our mind, we're going to write down as an option. And then we're just going to put those ideas up. And so even go buy some sticky tabs at your local Stuff Mart and teach them how to brainstorm, or take a dry erase board and just write ideas on the dry erase board. Now, once you have a bunch of ideas and concepts, you can begin refining that, but be careful. Even if your student gives you an option that may scare you a little bit as a parent, because maybe it doesn't follow the biblical principle, don't panic and shame them for that. Work with them on that. Explain to them, when you come to that concept, here's a concept that probably is more rooted in a humanistic thought than a biblical thought. What the Bible says is this, and we believe the Bible to be true. So the conclusion here that I would take would be that we should take the biblical approach versus a humanistic, man-centered, or evolutionary approach to this problem. And half of the problems that occurred, like even with the Native American schools, were rooted in the fact that evolution was one of the primary worldviews, and not everybody was thought to be as evolved as white people. Racism is rooted very heavily in evolutionary thought. So we can help guide the worldview, and we can begin writing the narrative of our worldview using the creative process. So we don't have to shame them, we don't have to panic, but we can help shape the culture by talking it through and looking for creative solutions to some of these things. So academically, as you go through the day and you find these topics, pick one that interests you. There are quotes like in You Report, Elementary History, where Genghis Khan says, basically, I'm the judgment of God. I don't know what you did to deserve me, but I'm the judgment of God. Talk about some of that. What could he possibly mean? Could God have used Genghis Khan to accomplish his purposes? And not a right or wrong answer. These are complicated things. We know when Genghis Khan lived. We know who Genghis Khan was. We know what he did factually, and who, where, when, where he did it geographically. But then let's talk about the why and the how, and allow room for creativity in that spot. Hopefully that makes some sense. But don't just get stuck on who, what, where, and when. And that's what a lot of times we look at these curriculums and we get frustrated, because that's what we want. We're perfectionists. We want to quantify and qualify our students' education by saying, no, they know who, what, where, and when. But we don't actually take it the step further in making sure that they can articulate and think creatively about the how and why. So those two components of asking why, Why? How could we do better? How could we learn from this? That's one great opportunity to develop creativity, even outside of academics. When we're talking about, what happened Wednesday night at Awana's, and we know who did it, where it happened, the who, what, where. But we can start talking about, well, why, and asking those questions to begin to help the student to think a little bit differently. Even we've talked about in the past, just empathy and developing empathy. Empathy is asking those questions. Empathy is asking some of the questions regarding the why and the how. Why would somebody act that way? And how can we help other people to feel comfortable so that they don't feel the need to act that way? It's causing them to think creatively. Okay? Okay, so there's one idea. Let's just give another practical idea, creativity. Your refrigerator right now as it stands, do an exercise. Take a sticky pad and say, okay, here's what we have, or do it however you want. Take just a notebook, or, I do a drawing pad, and all of my ideas, I just write out, and I don't worry about it being perfect. Nobody ever sees my pads. This pad is full of just brainstorms, and that's really what it is. It's just thoughts come to my mind, I write them down. I just put it all out there. And then I can go back through and cross out ideas. I can shape ideas and develop them further. But I start with just brainstorming. So there is no wrong. I'm not going to make a mistake by just putting an idea out there. I can refine it and correct it if I need to, but it allows me that freedom so that I don't become a slave to fear. Okay. So in my refrigerator, what foods are there? What foods do we have? And then let's creatively do an exercise that says, what meals could we make with the food that's in our refrigerator right now? If this was, the cooking channel, and I open my basket and these are the ingredients I have to make a meal, here's what we have in our refrigerator. What are the options? And as a family with your kids, just do that. Say, we're going to come up with as many ideas as we can with the food that's in the refrigerator. So that gives you the opportunity to start really trying to take these different concepts and be creative to answer. No right answer, no wrong answer. We can make anything we want as long as it's from food in the refrigerator. And then those types of exercises that just help begin exercising the creative muscles that you have. Now, again, the brain is lazy, doesn't like to burn calories. And so for us as adults, it gets harder and harder and harder. We don't like creativity. We like predictability. We like patterns. We like knowing what tomorrow holds. And so part of developing creativity for us is being willing to embrace adventure and try new things and go outside of our comfort zone a little bit. Because if we don't, it's really hard to be creative when creativity comes at a price, is what we would perceive. That then what if tomorrow is different? What if my car breaks down and my house burns or something terrible happens in my life, and I have to look at starting over or whatever? Those aren't places and things that our brain tends to like to do, right? We don't like pain, and sometimes change and those things we perceive as painful. So we have to just be willing to not allow our brains to defeat us in becoming creative as well. That it's good to challenge ourselves to things like this. And I'll say it requires some patience. When you have a team and you know the answer to the problem and you want to solve the problem, it's so much easier than trying to bring a team in and say, hey guys, let's brainstorm here. Let's come up with some ideas and begin teaching them how to problem solve and be creative thinkers. But in the long run, it's worth it. So what happens if you don't? If you become the brain for your family, you will always have to solve your family's problems. And you'll even find that they begin making bad decisions because they don't have the right narratives and the right training, the right worldview to make good decisions. If you put a little energy in at the front end and begin shaping them and teaching them and investing in them in the creative thinking aspect, but laying it in the healthy context of a biblical foundation, of a biblical worldview, what you'll see is as they age and get older, they'll become better at solving their own problems, which is what we want our children to do. It feels like I'm controlling and everything is wonderful when I can solve their problems, but most of the time I'm not as effective at running their lives as they are running their own lives, as long as they have proper training. So the ultimate goal of education, right, isn't that they bring me glory. It's that they are able to live successful, productive lives, bringing glory and honor to God Almighty. And in order for that to happen, I have to prepare them and train them for that process. So hopefully some of these tips were a little bit helpful and give you some ideas of ways to start just thinking outside the box and being creative. Again, the way you do this is you just begin exercising creative muscles. And then, as in, I've said this many times, reward the behavior you want. When your child shows creativity, when they go outside the box, when they problem solve by thinking of alternatives, give them praise for that, reward them for that, give them just a pat on the back that says, hey, I'm proud of you for doing that. That was awesome. Because they'll want to repeat that behavior. We enjoy rewards, we avoid pain. So if they step out and make a mistake, let them know you're proud of them for trying. You're proud of them for learning from their mistake. Not necessarily that they have to run from you because they made a mistake, but that even in our mistakes, there are growth opportunities, learning opportunities that we can not repeat again if we don't want to make those same mistakes. All right. Hey, awesome. Well, hopefully, again, this was helpful for somebody, and we pray we want your homeschools to be creative places. We want you to have life and energy, and we want your kids to be excited about learning and you to be excited about learning as well.